I've had quite a few people ask for this video for a while, and I didn't know enough at the time to explain it. I've also heard people refer to solarpunk as a utopian vision, and not a realistic genre. First, we have to hammer out what punk actually means. The Chinese currently have a movement called lying flat, or let it rot, depending on the level of discontent with the current establishment. They're purposely doing the bare minimum, thereby becoming worthless to the establishment. Punk throughout the ages goes back to Shakespeare, which meant worthless, rotten, or useless. It even became associated with sex workers, and the term queer, especially bottom, in a coercive unequal relationship. It, at its core, meant useless, things thrown away. It was also a verb meant to be fooled. On the other side of the pond, it had a different meaning entirely. The Lenape word punk, which I know I'm butchering, meant ashes, and punksa meant one who puts wood on a fire. Some used it to mean rotting wood or tinder, and even gunpowder in the 1600s. The Americans were referred to as fighting like punk in the Revolutionary War. By the early 1800s, it had reacquired its rotten and worthless meaning in the US. In the late 1800s until the 1950s, punk became associated with low-quality work, which art then took on to mean DIY as opposed to industrialized highbrow art. Just because it was low cost didn't mean it wasn't enjoyable. It also became associated with class wars and class struggle. Local amateur theater would be considered punk by standards of that time. Kansas was where the term punk music first arose in the late 1800s, where they would have punk orchestras, and by the early 1900s, it was used to imply low quality, or for the working man, depending on where in the class divide you stood. People viewed punk music as much more honest and open, and not snooty or uptight, and sour notes here and there were considered rugged and American. In the 1950s and onward, young people began pushing back against society and the mainstream. They became anti-consumerist and embraced anarchist ideals. Get a job and a haircut became a common phrase against these young people, as they aren't working normal jobs, therefore they're useless, aka punks. The young people embraced the term as their own, and one could say that the punk movement was what the American anarchist movement and the hippie ideology movement merged into after the disappointment of the fact that free love didn't bring about utopia. The ideology around the punk movement was centered around mutual aid, anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, non-conformity, direct action, and DIY. This, as I mentioned in the degrowth video, would make the GDP fall and make you useless to the powers that be. This created a plethora of artistic movements, music, art, literature, and fashion. It was all gritty, messy, and raw because being DIY, it was a bunch of amateurs trying to make stuff that fit themselves instead of a clean, professional, efficient, standardized, machined, and bought item. Stripped-down music, single-run zines, mohawks, studs on used items, often reworked military gear actively degrading the uniform as a form of protest. Punk literature was mostly zines until Bruce Bethke made a list of words meaning technology and one meaning troublemaker. It was a direct response to Reaganism, as the artist viewed cyberpunk as a logical conclusion to neoliberalism, which is very much the norm now. Thus, cyberpunk was born, and it involved a possible future, or just logical inevitable future, that neoliberalism would lead to push back against. After that, punk became associated with retrofuturism, creating a better idealized version of what people hoped the future would bring, following the logic of what if the science at the time actually worked the way they hoped. Steampunk, dieselpunk, atomic ray gun, clockwork punk, all were a way to use aesthetics, but with a what-if spin, usually involving a more ethical past that never was, but encouraging the people celebrating it to explore the more uncomfortable side of the past they may never have looked into. However, the punk movement still continued, even though a lot of the aesthetics became corporatized by places like Hot Topics, completely abandoning all the ethos around it and turning it into just a costume, much like they did with the Beat Generation as beatniks and the hippies. The punk movement consists to this day. Many are rediscovering their anarchist roots, including the ability to organize, something the punk movement and the West in general appears to have completely forgotten how to do in the oversimplification of self-expression and nonconformity. Neoliberalism co-opted that to mean hyper-individualism, something that makes organizing impossible, and is the ideology of neoliberalism at its core, even though it also means communism for the wealthy and individualism for the little people. When Solarpunk came out, it leaned on both the punk movement and the retro-future punk literary genre. There are two varieties of Solarpunk in terms of art and literature: the transition to a Solarpunk future, which is often messy and violently inflicted by the powerful, and a post-transition world, which one may refer to as solar core instead of Solarpunk, like cottagecore with solar panels and windmill kites. If you live in a Solarpunk world, there is nothing subversive about it. It's now the norm, and therefore no longer considered punk because there's no conflict. In fact, I've seen people say that Solarpunk stories can only be a slice of life, which, in reality, Solar Core can only be a slice of life. Solarpunk, on the other hand, as a movement, is very violent. Solar Core is part of the punk movement, as it is an act of defiance, as it's not giving in to doomerism. While punk in this case doesn't refer to the troublemaking aspect, more the punk ethos if it became mainstream. People view this as utopian, but it's all possible if people can get on board with it and organize, which in itself may be utopian to dream about. Organizing is a key ingredient that has been missing from the punk movement for decades now. Solarpunk takes both threads of punk as both punk ideology in terms of retrofuturism, as most of the Solarpunk really is going back to the way things used to be organized: public transit, compact housing, right to repair, DIY, as well as the troublemaking side of punk, which is what is required if we ever want this to happen. If anything, Solarpunk is double punk as a mix of both terms through distinguishing the difference between Solarpunk as a movement and a transition genre, and Solar Core as a post-transition genre might be the better way to prevent people from being confused, since the word has confused, messy meanings. But that's what punk has always been: messy, disorganized, and meaning something different for everyone in many individual ways. Hence the use of the term solarpunk, and why in the end, solarpunk is very punk, even if the end goal is solar core, which shows us what we could hope to aspire to reach with that movement if we stick to the punk ideals. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you wish to be a part of this project, or want your Solarpunk art displayed discussing any of our main points of focus, please send everything to solarpunkusa@proton.me. There is also a Patreon link for my main channel if you like what I'm doing. For the first section involving community building, this channel will be run directly by myself. After that point, I hope to make this a collaborative project with many people involved, including voice, information, and editing, to make this a robust channel that can spread and grow.